Welcome everyone to today's UNICON webinar on perspectives, how university-based executive education is viewed by faculty and clients. My name is Rob Dietl. I'm with MIT Sloan Executive Education, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. We're glad you can join us and just want to start out with a brief reminder that today's webinar will be recorded and will be posted on the UNICON website later for review, or if you'd want to share it with your colleagues that aren't able to join today, we'd encourage you to do so. As we get started, I have just a few housekeeping items that I'd like to cover. Hopefully you all saw some of the links that came with the invitation to this webinar that bring you to more in-depth coverage on the UNICON website on the articles that have been written and contributed on these perspectives for university-based executive education. If you haven't had a chance to visit the UNICON website to explore those articles in depth, I'd encourage you to do so. Also, as we get going, I want to just remind you that we will be taking questions and answers. We do allow time at the end of the program for the questions and answers, but if you have an urgent question, please feel free to submit that. The way you can ask your questions throughout the webinar or during the Q&A period is to use the question box that is located in your navigation panel for today's webinar. Simply type in your question, submit it, and we'll be able to see that and share that with today's presenter. Also want to let you know that today's webinar is governed by the UNICON Antitrust and Competition Statement. Like all of our events, we abide by these antitrust and competition laws. As you'll see here, that we don't really get into discussions that would lead to any conflict with this policy. So with that in mind, we have a lot of information to cover today. I would like to welcome our presenter. Michael Devlin is the principal at Athru Services. Athru is actually UNICON's external communications partner and works with UNICON closely throughout the year on a variety of issues. We're very fortunate to have Michael with us today, guiding us through today's webinar. Michael has quite a bit of experience in the realm of executive education. Prior to founding Athru in 2012, he served as the Associate Dean of Executive Education at Case Western Reserve University's Weatherhead School of Management for 5 years. He's also served in other roles at Cuyahoga Community College and at Boston College's Carroll School of Management. One of the things that struck me was there was also reference in his biography that he served as the Senior Director of Communications for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, something I haven't seen before. Michael has a lot of knowledge and has put together a great webinar today on the perspectives of both faculty and clients that I think you'll find very insightful. So often we hear from our clients that getting the voice of the customer is important and really critical to accomplishing an organization's mission. And I think by the end of today's webinar, you'll get a much better sense of the perspective of both faculty and clients, clearly very important constituents for us, executive education. So with that, over to you, Michael. Thanks again for leading today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Rob. It's a real pleasure to be here. Hi, everyone. Special thanks to Rob. Rob does a lot of work behind the scenes on these webinars that people don't know much about. Also to Dan Collins, UNICON's webmaster, to Bill Shire, UNICON's executive director, and of course to you for attending this webinar today. I am cognizant of the fact that the World Cup is going on, but I think we're sandwiched in between today's matches. So for those of you from around the world who are following your team, I hope we're not taking you away from any fun action. So let me just say a little bit about Athru Services. Rob touched on it a little bit. We were founded in 2012, and between myself and my founding partner, Karen Kuda, we have more than 20 years experience in sort of business school and executive education, which I hope will add a little color to today's webinar. Athru is a weird word. It's named after the Irish word. We're named after the Irish word for change. We are, as Rob mentioned, UNICON's external communications partner, and we're really in about 4 different businesses: strategic planning and development. We do a lot of change management work, communications, which is what we do with UNICON, and team and leadership development. So that's a little bit about Athru, and it's just a real pleasure to be here and to share this work with you today. So what our objective for today is, so we have put together as Rob said, a couple of interesting articles exploring how faculty feel about executive education and how our clients feel about us in executive education. And we thought, well, it might be useful to put a little webinar together just to pull out the highlights from each of these articles. You know, we often talk to each other about the industry, and many of the articles that Athru has written for UNICON, we've sort of interviewed each other. We've interviewed other executive directors, we've interviewed other folks in the industry, and we thought, boy, it might be nice to go right to the horse's mouth, right, and say, ask the faculty, ask clients, look, what do you really think about us as providers? And we thought we might get insights that maybe you might not get. So your faculty and clients might tell me things that they're not likely to tell you directly. So that's really our goal, is to sort of tease out some insights from both faculty and clients that you might not hear on a daily basis. If you've read the two articles, that's great. I'll try to add a little additional color here and there and include material that didn't make it into the articles. But if you haven't read the articles, don't worry about it. We're going to cover the highlights here, and you may want to go back and read them at some point after the webinar, but I think we'll touch on all the highlights in the next half hour or so. And of course, at the end, I can answer any questions that you might have. My goal today is to spend about 15 minutes each on faculty and on clients. So split the time about half and half. The approach that we took was that we interviewed these folks really in 2017 and early this year in 2018. All this is sort of important. All the clients and faculty were recommended by university-based executive education professionals. So there's probably a little bias there. You're unlikely to give me a faculty member to talk to who can't stand you. And the same with unsuccessful client engagements. So there's a little bit of a bias toward, obviously toward, you know, faculty who are engaged in exec ed and who are interested in it and who are supportive of it, and successful client engagement. So I just want to have you keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of the insights. I would also say it's a relatively small sample size. It was a handful of faculty and a handful of clients, but I think I tried to bring to bear on those articles and in today's webinar insights that I picked up in previous interviews that I've done and in my own work as an associate dean for 5 years at the Weatherhead School. So let's just dive in and deal with faculty first of all. So when we started talking to faculty, there were a few things we were interested in. What do they think about us in general? What do they think about this tension between teaching and research? We hear a lot about that, right? So you probably talk to faculty all the time and to your dean about this notion of, I can't have faculty teaching in exec ed. I want them all with their heads buried in their research. So we wanted to ask about that. We thought we'd ask about any frustrations that they may have had working with us over the years and opportunities for improvement. Compensation we thought was interesting, not so much relative compensation, one school to another, but is compensation a decision driver, one direction or another? And we did ask specifically about the influence of the dean. So we're going to hear about each of those issues in the next sort of 10, 12 minutes. So the first thing I would say is that generally faculty were very positive about exec ed. Again, I'd remind you that it's sort of a skewed set to some extent, but everyone we spoke to, every faculty member we spoke to really thought that exec ed added real value to the institution that they worked at. They interestingly see university-based executive education as a reputation builder. So they felt that a good exec ed department within the business school really builds the reputation of the school. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Of course, they value the financial contribution that we make. And they thought it was an interesting reality check with the business world. So they had an opportunity in interacting with the business world to make sure that their research, their work was sort of consistent with what's going on in the business world, and they really appreciated that feedback. And this last point is similar to that. There was sort of an immediacy issue, meaning that they could be embroiled in the research one day and literally check it out the next day with a group of sort of seasoned business executives. So they may have some sort of theoretical construct or some ideas that they're pursuing in the research. This gives them the chance to get in a classroom right away and say, hey, is this consistent? Does this ring true for you as an audience? And get sort of real immediate feedback on their research. So they really like that. In terms of their teaching skills and the impact of their teaching skills, you know, it was sort of interesting. It became clear during the interviews, and this ought to resonate with you, I think, that faculty really found that teaching in exec ed provided them with a real two-way street. So not only were they imparting information or knowledge to the participants in the exec ed classroom, but they were learning themselves. And I think, you know, we had several faculty members in our interviews say, I learned something in every single class. Every single time I teach in exec ed, I'm getting as much as I'm giving. And this notion of experience matters was really pretty important to them. So you all know that the executives in your classrooms and in your exec ed programs are much more experienced than, you know, certainly in any undergrad that these faculty would be teaching, and even much more experienced than your average MBA student. So for the faculty, that really counted, that really mattered for them, that was important for them. So they had an opportunity to really get feedback from people who had 10 or 15 or 20 years of business experience that they just can't get in an undergrad or even an MBA classroom. So that notion of experience in the classroom really mattered to them. As I said, they have an opportunity to try out new material, and this one was sort of interesting that, you know, teaching in exec ed provides material for other teaching that they may be doing. And I sort of identified this as kind of your first point of leverage with faculty. So, you know, we tend to think that we're beholden to faculty, we're constantly kind of imploring them to come teach in exec ed and sell them on the notion of teaching. And I want to call out during this little presentation a few what I call points of leverage that I think you have as an exec ed professional in your interactions with faculty. And I think that these ideas on this page are some of those that, you know, they're going to get great feedback, they could try out new material, and the work that they put into providing or creating the presentation for the exec ed classroom is work that they can leverage somewhere else at a later date, maybe even in consulting assignments. So it seems to me that is a kind of a point of leverage for you as you're negotiating with faculty. I hope that as we go through this, you'll realize that you got more leverage than you think. So then this notion of teaching and research and the tension between the two, I will say, you know, this is a huge issue for faculty and for deans. You probably know this already, but, you know, first and foremost, they want to be researchers. First and foremost, they want to get tenure, right? So that's a driver for them, it's a driver for their deans. So you bump into this all the time. How do you get junior faculty who aren't tenured yet to come teach in your exec ed classrooms? So very big issue, and we certainly want to dig into that. What we found was that there's a ton of variability by school and by department. So it was interesting, one of the profs we spoke to was from MIT. from Rob Diedel's school, and he said something interesting. He said, well, at MIT, we're all about how we take this research and make it actionable, make it practical for the business world. So he said, of course, we want to get it in the executive classroom. So we and other schools that are maybe have got less of that sort of practical application of research perspective felt that to a lesser extent. But we found some of the factors that caused this variability was, we've listed them on there. The subject matter, that's pretty obvious. If you're teaching organizational behavior or strategy, then you kind of want to get in the executive classroom, right? You want to be there to sort of check it out if that's what your area of research is. But if you're researching finance or accounting, then maybe it's less practical or less necessary to get that immediate feedback. Faculty seniority is obvious to you. The more senior the faculty, the more apt they are to say, well, I can get in the executive classroom, I can take my research there. Whereas junior faculty, there's so much pressure on them to get their research done and get tenure. These last two, pride and ability to perform, was kind of interesting. So one of the faculty members said to me, we're human beings too, we're people too. And I mean, that seems sort of a comical thing to say, but what he was saying there was, I don't want to get into a classroom full of execs where the pressure's pretty high if I don't think I'm going to be able to perform there, if I don't think I'm going to be able to do well. So I have some pride in my work, and I don't want to embarrass myself in a room of senior experienced executives where I don't do well. So, my takeaway from that is, and I would say to you, don't take shyness or awkwardness personally. These people want to succeed too, and you may find that really the reason they're pushing back is more to do with these two issues, pride and their ability to perform, than it does really in the construct of your school and your program. This last one was interesting, that we had several faculty members say, being in the executive classroom is a research enhancer, right? That it actually enhances my research. It makes it better because I can incorporate some of what I've heard in the executive classroom directly into my research. So I'm calling this sort of a second point of leverage for you, that as you're trying to convince faculty to teach in your programs, you may want to look for synergies and say, how can you, the faculty member, bolster or improve your research by being in my classroom? The next thing we asked them about were frustrations, and frustrations they had teaching in exec ed, and some of these are going to seem obvious to you. The preparation is time consuming. We know that, right? So if you're getting into teaching possibly new material that you haven't dealt with before, or certainly customizing it for a particular audience, then there's some time required to prepare for that. So we understand that, right? This one was interesting. Many factors outside their control. So we had them complain about things, not complain, but they're worried about things like, is the food good? Is the temperature in the room good? If it's an open enrollment class, what's the composition of the class? They feel like those are factors that are kind of outside their control, and in other settings, they feel like they have a little bit more control over that. This one was sort of interesting, and I was struck by it because in 5 years as an associate dean, I'd never heard this before, but we had several faculty members say this, that they got to schedule this stuff too far in advance. So, we're publishing our calendar for the year of our open enrollment programs, or we're scheduling custom clients, pretty far in advance. So we're asking these faculty members to put something on their calendar, maybe 9 months or 12 months before they actually do it. And they said, that can be really frustrating to them that they do that, and then they find out over the course of that 9 or 12 months that they've turned on a lot of other really interesting things because they're sort of committed to this so far ahead of time. The last one was also interesting, that the client isn't ready for change. So you bring in a custom client and you've developed this program for them, and you're excited about it and they're excited about it. And the faculty member realizes pretty early on that in reality, this client just isn't ready to make a big change, that they're kind of going through the motions. So that was something that was expressed to us a couple of times, and that can be frustrating for the faculty member. Another sort of call out that I would just say is that you can limit some of those frustrations. Some of those things are within your control to do something about, and I would just urge you to think about these as you work with faculty and find ways to sort of mitigate those frustrations. In terms of opportunities, there were really two major opportunities that they called out. One is to work even more closely with the client. You'll hear this also when I talk about clients here in a minute. But faculty are really saying, look, work even more closely with the client, speak their language, understand their culture, understand their challenges, engage with them at a strategic level. So really get deep in your relationship with your client. Really understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish. Don't sort of give up halfway through a conversation with the client and say, oh, I think I got it. I think I know what you're looking for. Keep asking questions, keep going deeper. The faculty really thought that that's a big opportunity for us as exec ed providers. And this second one is interesting. Faculty would love that we were able to use the exec ed classroom as an opportunity to gather data. So, yes, we're sort of disseminating knowledge, information, teaching to this group of folks, but can we build a data set based on this interaction? Every one of them, I think, said this to us at one point or other, that they would love that we use the classroom as an opportunity to gather data. They thought it helps clients. So, over time, you've built up enough empirical data that you can start to use that with, future clients, that it helps faculty with their research, obviously, and it can attract new faculty. So this was sort of interesting, right? So if you can promise a new faculty member that we're going to help you with your research by using the exec ed classroom as a place to build a data set, then you might be more likely to get them involved in what it is you're doing. So an interesting one, something to think about. I know there's all sorts of issues around that, confidentiality issues, but other ways that you can anonymously gather data and share it with other clients and with faculty. We touched on this notion of compensation with each of the faculty that we interviewed, and we were interested to hear that a lot of them think that exec ed can actually be more lucrative than degree programs. So that's an interesting data point. But potentially less lucrative than consulting opportunities. That it's somewhere between the two. They can make a little bit more money doing exec ed than degree programs, but a little less than if they were engaged in a consulting opportunity. But they said this really interesting point, that when you do exec ed, you get to drive to work and sleep in your own bed. That was a direct quote from one of the faculty members. Whereas if you're doing a consulting gig, you might be halfway around the world or another part of the country doing that consulting gig. So even though it can generate more revenue for them, they don't get to drive to work and they don't get to sleep in their own bed. And I think this is a third point of leverage potentially for you. Remember what we said earlier, that faculty are people too, and they're interested in going home to the kids at the end of the day and getting to that football practice. just as much as anybody else is. And when they're pulled away halfway around the world to do a consulting gig, they just don't have that opportunity. So make sure you're leveraging that. The last thing we talked to them about is the influence of the dean. And we found that certainly this influence can be either for or against exec ed. Again, as I mentioned earlier, junior faculty can be really actively discouraged from participating by deans. And just want to say that there are several influencers on faculty as to whether or not they want to be actively engaged in exec ed, but the influence of the dean is really powerful. So the call out here would be to get your dean on board as much as possible. This little series that we're doing, this series of articles on faculty and clients, the third leg on the stool is going to be deans. And so if you're on this seminar and webinar and you think that your dean might be interested in being interviewed for an article like this, we'd love to hear from you. But we really do want to go deep with deans also, and just really try to get their perspective on what exec ed means to the business school, to the university, how they feel it lines up, what sort of a priority it is for them, etc. So we'll dig deeper with deans, but just for you to know that deans are a very powerful influencer in the minds of faculty. So that's what we came up with, just some of the interesting points that were raised in these articles. Again, I would urge you to read them if you're interested in that, and certainly feel free to ask questions at the end of this webinar. We'll leave enough time for you to ask questions about any other thoughts you might have or questions you might have around our conversations with faculty. But now I want to switch gears and talk about clients a little bit. So hopefully that was about 15 minutes, might have been a little bit longer than that, I apologize. And now we'll spend about 15 minutes talking about our interviews with clients. So we were interested in a few issues with them. Why do they engage university-based exec ed? What do they consider as alternatives to us? Generally speaking, what they think about us, how they measure impact, and areas we might have for improvement. So why they engage? No doubt, leadership development came across as really the most important reason that they engage exec ed. So they think about succession planning. They think about continuing the culture and maintaining the culture of the organization as something really important. They think a lot about this experience chasm. So this came up in literally, I think, every interview we did. So each of these clients really feels the effect of baby boomers starting to retire, and this large sort of next generation of employees that are coming along to replace them, and they're really worried about losing institutional knowledge. They're really worried about, several of them use this term, experience chasm or experience gap that they're dealing with at their organization. And they're asking for exec ed to help plug that gap. So it really feels to me, talking to them, that now is a particularly important time and a great opportunity for you to be out talking to these companies and really referencing this notion that with your retirees, significant numbers of retirees coming along, is the next generation ready to take their place and run the company. And I think it's a real opportunity for you to leverage. And then, of course, the notion of strategy competence. So are our leaders, particularly the next generation of leaders, competent enough in the area of strategy? So, the impression I had after doing these interviews with clients is that you really do important work, right? That this isn't trivial work you're doing. This isn't throwaway work. It's really important, and it's important to your clients. They value you greatly, and you're not just churning out the latest thought of the day or flavor of the month in terms of what you're doing. You're really helping them significantly, And when you make that connection with the client, it's incredibly powerful. We asked them about alternatives to university-based executive education. So when they came at this moment where they said, you know, we need some help, what else did they consider? And of course, the first thing they considered was consulting firms. And I think everyone we talked to had considered using consulting firms. And I think the strengths that they called out in terms of using consulting firms was that they, and we heard this a couple of times, really slick presentations, right? That when the consulting firm came in, boy, they really knocked them sideways with just how good everything looked, how professional everything was, how slick everything was. They said consulting firms had a really holistic, big picture view of the business. So they weren't just about, you know, this little narrow area of work that we need done. They really had a big picture view of the business. And surprisingly to me, they said that consulting firms were really cost competitive. So I was not prepared for that. I thought they would not be, but you know, and I guess there's a lot of there's a real range there, right? But that they felt that they were cost competitive. And so my takeaway for you as an executive provider is that, you know, form matters, professionalism matters, the slickness of your presentation matters, the way that you present yourselves matter. And I know that a lot of us, you know, struggle with this notion of business development, and it doesn't always feel really comfortable to us. And for some of these consulting firms, it is what they do, and it feels very comfortable. So just a heads up that the form matters of things that you present. This next thing was really kind of alarming to me. And I think if there's one sort of big takeaway you should have from this webinar, I hope there are several, but one that really struck me is that luck really played a big part in so many of these client engagements that we explored. So one of them came about just because of an existing relationship. And I'll quote to you from the article itself. It was a client who was dealing with University of British Columbia in Canada. And he said some of these firms were charging more than UBC, but some were charging less. He's talking about consulting firms. If we didn't already have a relationship with UBC and really appreciated what we would be getting, it would have been harder to turn down these proposals. So basically, he said that without the existing relationship with the university, he'd have gone with a consulting firm instead. So just sort of think about that if the relationship didn't exist, he was so blown away by the presentations of these consulting firms that he would have gone with one of them. This next one, it was a personal relationship that made it happen. And again, I'll quote to you from the article. This was from a client who worked with the Cox School at SMU, and specifically with Frank Lloyd, the associate dean there. And he said to me, I know Frank Lloyd on a personal level, and I asked him for advice. That's what led us to use SMU. Without that personal connection, I think there's a 50-50 chance that we'd have developed this program. In other words, there's a 50-50 chance that he wouldn't have done this at all and wouldn't have done anything if he didn't happen to know Frank Lloyd on a social level, right? So that kind of scares me. That makes me nervous. This next one was about timing and persistence on the part of the school. And this is a longer quote, but again, it's taken right from the article, and I just want to read it to you. As I look back on it with several years of hindsight, this is what a vice president said to me at a $10 billion consumer products company. As I look back on it with several years of hindsight, it was really more about happenstance and luck than any great strategic alliance. By the way, this company invested more than $1 million in this program. This partnership fell into our lap. If the school's business development person had not been so persistent and had not offered us a complimentary seat, the partnership would probably not have happened. It makes me wonder if executive education departments do an adequate job of marketing themselves. We didn't know what the school had to offer, and if we hadn't accidentally bumped into each other, we would have gone in a completely different direction. So again, this $10 billion consumer products company was about 40 miles from this school. And they said, we didn't know what the school had to offer, and if we hadn't accidentally bumped into each other, we would have gone in a completely different direction. And then this last one, it took a nudge from a CEO to make it happen. And again, I'll quote from the article. Then our CEO suggested we reach out to Melbourne University in Australia. They have an incredible reputation, so they were top of mind, but it took a nudge from the CEO to initiate the first call. So what I would say to you here, the challenge that I would offer to you here is, are you telling the right story to the right people? And you could add to this, are you telling it at the right time? So I was kind of alarmed as I spoke to these clients about how much luck played a part in them engaging with their university-based executive education partner. And I just wonder if we're doing a good job, and this is more probably to the smaller schools and the larger schools, but are we doing a good job of telling our story and making sure people understand what it is we have to offer? Because I heard far too often in these discussions with clients that that was not the case, and that it was a little bit of blind luck. So quickly moving into a couple of other pretty obvious issues that we heard from clients. Building relationship, how important was that to them? And they listed some compelling elements that they considered of a relationship. I just lay these out here for you. These are pretty obvious. Being on a campus. This one, the third one, faculty credibility, is sort of interesting. We hear a lot about companies and CEOs in particular hiring big consulting firms, right? And they never name them, obviously. And part of the reason they hire them is because that consulting firm gives them coverage for decisions that they might make. So they can always say, well, XYZ consulting firm recommended this, even if it doesn't go well, or if the board ends up being unhappy with the results. We also find the same thing a little bit, to a lesser extent, with faculty. The faculty bring a real credibility to some issues. So if a company decides to go in a particular strategic direction, and that was recommended by a really highly renowned faculty member, that can be really important. So I think number 3 there, faculty credibility, is something that we often tend to overlook, but it's real at the level of our clients. The 5th one there, a long-term relationship that accommodates change. It's interesting. We often are shy about asking for a long-term commitment from our clients. I know I was when I was an associate dean. I was so happy to get the first gig that I was kind of reluctant to say, well, let's think about what this looks like over 5 years. But it's interesting. Your client's interested in that. Clients don't want to skip around from one provider to another. They want to have a long-term relationship. So don't be afraid to ask for that. But make sure that when you talk to them about a long-term relationship, that you can accommodate change within that relationship. So you don't get locked into saying, we're going to do the same thing here over and over again for the next 5 years or 10 years, or whatever it is. But say, look, we'd love to engage with you long-term, but we're cognizant of the fact that change is going to happen. And we're willing to embrace change, and we're willing to change the program to meet your changing needs. That's really speaking their language. And then this last one we touched on earlier, be really interested in the client. We had clients tell us, our exec ed provider sends us articles that are just interesting to read that have nothing to do with our relationship with them. They're just interested enough to say, hey, look, you ought to read this. It's kind of interesting. Those sorts of little gestures showing interest in the client can make a real difference. And they want to be challenge the client. And then the last one there, manage the faculty. So this was sort of cute. Some people talked about, our faculty can be a little weird sometimes, right? We all have faculty with outsized personalities, and someone can be a little bit strange. And potentially a little bit of a challenge to deal with. So the client said, we love that. We want them to be quirky and weird and interesting, but we expect you to really manage that and make sure that they understand who it is they're talking to and what the program's about. So really manage your faculty. Measuring success was an issue that we talked about with them. You know, again, this was a bit alarming to me. Most clients could not quantify the impact of the program. And I will tell you that question has been asked at the highest level. So CEOs are asking, you know, vice presidents of organizational development to quantify the impact of the program. And we tend to prioritize participant satisfaction over participant development. So we tend to say, oh, it was great, the participants loved it, right? That tends to be the way that we evaluate the program and quantify the impact of it, rather than how have they changed over time. So I think that this is something we really got to get better at. And, you know, soft measures are better than no measures at all. So even if it's saying 90 days out, yes, this participant's supervisor says or manager says that, yes, they have grown in this area, that's better than nothing. But I will tell you, I think this is a real pressing need for us in our industry. And speaking to these clients, even the clients that were really happy with the program that they had created with their executive provider, even those that were happy could not quantify the impact of the program. And I think that you know, there are competitors out there who might figure that out before we do. So I really challenge you to think about that as you move forward. I just have 2 more slides, so I know it's we're about 42 minutes in, so just a couple more slides to go. We asked clients, what advice would you give for exec ed providers? The first one, invest in relationships. Don't walk away after a couple of meetings. Really interesting quote from the article about this. Someone said, in our business, we are patient with our clients. We expect the same from you. So really interesting, right? Next, think bigger than the executive education department or even the business school. So one of our clients really hammered this home. She's talking there about, you know, you as the executive provider, you feel like you own the relationship with your client, right? That's a very important thing to you. And you kind of protect that relationship. And in some cases, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody else, you don't even want your dean to get their hands on that relationship, right? Like you really want to own that as the exec ed associate dean, and you don't want your dean getting his hands on this client because you don't know where that's going to go. This particular client said to us, you've got to think bigger than your own department or even the business school. You've got to be thinking about how can this client fully leverage the entire university. If you're at a university, how can they leverage the entire university? And the quote was from this client, exec ed staff should be willing to explore those options. Even though they lose a little control, it will end up okay. And without that deeper organization to organization relationship, you run the risk that your engagement with the client is purely transactional. So just want to put that out there. Would be remiss if I didn't mention that. The next comment we've talked about, beware of consulting firms. One quote we got was, it's hard for universities to attract the same high quality business development people and create the same slick presentations. So we've touched on that already. Listen to your clients is important. And then I think I just want to say this again, really market yourselves. You know, are you doing that? Are you marketing yourselves as well as you possibly could? And there's so many inexpensive ways to do that as well as the obvious expensive ones. There's a quote we got again from the article, which said, there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort to market these programs. This possibility was not on our radar. So this is the client speaking. This possibility was not on our radar. Why didn't we know about this, right? So this is a client in a major US city with multiple exec ed providers. And he said it was not on his company's radar. And why didn't we know about this? So just a little challenge to all of you today to think about that. And then just a couple of other observations. This is the last slide. It was interesting, no one raised cost as a deal-breaking issue. Some of these clients spent over $1 million on their engagement. No one really raised that as a major deal breaker. Fame matters, and this is a challenge for smaller schools. So the reputation of your school really matters. And make sure you're doing everything you can to build the reputation of your exec ed department and your school, because it really matters. These folks are more likely to pick up the phone and call the Harvards and the LBSs of the world than they are some of the smaller schools. So it's a big challenge for smaller schools to really get your hands around. And then the last observation, there is a talent shortage out there, and people really feel, clients really feel that what you do is more important than ever to try to mitigate that talent shortage. And it's a real way for you to tell your story about developing folks and making sure that you're helping them develop their own talent, since they're having a hard time filling the talent shortage. So that is the last comment that I have. We're at 45 minutes. Rob, back over to you. Happy to answer any questions that anyone may have about any other observations we picked up in the course of this research.
Great, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insight on both our clients and our faculty and what's on their mind. Really interesting to see some of the trends and where some opportunities are, and also some challenges for executive education providers. At this time, we would like to open it up for questions and answers. So just a reminder, please use the question box on your navigation panel to submit your questions, and we'll relay those for Michael's comments. With that in mind, we already have a few coming in. Michael, the first question is with something that you just covered in the last few slides. In regards to clients saying to think bigger than the exec ed department, what is missing in exec ed only programs that the larger university can provide?
Yes, that's a great question, Rob. This particular, well, we heard that from several folks, but one client in particular really talked about it. And what she had in mind is, they're a big company. They're in a lot of different fields, and they're partnering with a university, business schools, executive education department, but the university itself is also a multifaceted institution. So, her comment to me was, that university is an engineering school. Why aren't we seeing, is there a potential partnership between ourselves and the engineering school in terms of some of the products that we produce? You have expertise in things like design, right? And we've got a packaging department in our company. Why weren't we talking to one another about ways to leverage those types of attributes that the university has? So it was really for her about, you've got this multifaceted university. We're a multifaceted organization. Why does the partnership have to stop with the business school? Yes, we're both in business, and we're all about business, but there's a lot else going on in our organization. You can think about things like food science, engineering, those types of things. Why aren't we seeing other ways that we can connect and make this an even bigger and more substantial relationship? Now, I know that that's scary to exec ed folks, because you lose some control of that relationship. But from their perspective, and you've got to always take the client's perspective, they're saying, there are other ways that we could have engaged with the university, that we'd love to have, undergraduate interns coming to work for us from the engineering school, as a classic example, right? So they're just looking for a more holistic relationship than they were provided with at the business school level, the exec ed level.
Great, thank you. We have a couple of questions also coming in from the audience, wondering whether or not this slide deck will be available. And just as a reminder, I do think we're making the slide deck available, and certainly this webinar, just as a reminder, will be recorded and posted to YouTube via the UNICON website. So for those of you that are interested in sharing this with your colleagues, or possibly now hearing about the importance of getting deans on board, you may even want to share this presentation or this recording with your dean. Another question coming in, Michael, is regarding faculty. You touched on the positive attributes of teaching in executive education, and you also commented on some of the frustrations that faculty have or perceive when teaching in executive education. Do you get any sense, or did you get any comments about how the shift or the evolution of online programs may be impacting faculty's interest in participating in executive education?
Boy, that's a great question, Rob. You know, we talked quite a bit about online learning, and it's really interesting from a faculty perspective. So, you know, the difference between synchronous and asynchronous learning certainly came up. And there were faculty who really felt that in some ways, asynchronous learning has got some positive attributes that we do not do a good enough job of talking about. So, you know, we all tend to think that kind of the spontaneous connections that happen in classrooms are, you know, the most valuable way to teach, and there's certainly a good argument to be made for how valuable those are. But there were faculty members who said, look, I have more astute observations and more thoughtful comments coming from some of my students, participants, whatever you want to call them, who are engaged with me in an asynchronous way because they have time to go off and think about these concepts and really come back and ask, you know, much better questions, be much more thoughtful about the responses. So I thought it was interesting that some faculty found that, you know, that almost prefer or enjoy aspects of online learning that kind of surprised me. I thought they were all just be junkies for the interaction in the classroom, but really, you know, several of them made that point that they really enjoy sort of asynchronous interaction.
Okay, great. And as we shift, kind of looking over to the client perspective in terms of online offerings and capabilities, we talked a lot about, or we heard a lot about consultants and consulting firms as competitors. Did you get any sense that there might be other forms of competition out there from non-traditional providers, especially kind of leveraging online technologies to provide executive development? Yeah,
no question about it. You know, someone said to me in another article, neither of these articles, but in research I was doing for a different article, they made the comment that, you know, we in the executive education field are in an interesting world where every single thing you ever need to know is available online for free, right? So that comment has sort of stuck with me over the years, and it can be a scary comment. And I think, so we did talk to clients specifically about this issue of online learning. And, you know, and the potential for other challenges to our business model, right, that might come, which I think is your question, that could come from some combination of other entities and online learning. And, you know, engagement is a real issue for them. They're dealing with people who are unbelievably busy. So if, just like everyone who's on this webinar today, as an example, is really busy, and yet you all chose to participate in this, and I really appreciate that, and we do at UNICON really appreciate that. But given the demands on folks, if the learning is provided in a way that is entirely sort of asynchronous, that's self-directed, that is potentially not that same level of engagement that we tend to offer in the university-based executive education world, they worry that very busy executives are just not going to participate in it. They're just going to find other more important things to do that day. So, you know, one of the comments on one of the slides was about getting to a college campus. And I think that was less about being on a nice, beautiful, leafy college campus as it was about sort of having your executives captive and present, and the opportunities that presented. You know, yes, it's also nice that they're on the campus of, you know, in this case, I think it was Southern Methodist University. They're on a beautiful campus. That's important, but also they're captive. They're there. They're paying attention, and they're live and in person. And that, I think, a lot of clients feel is a real competitive advantage for us that is not easily replicated by any other combination of organizing entities and online learning.
Right, great, thank you. One last call for questions as we're approaching the top of the hour, as we're awaiting any final questions through the question box on your Navigator panel. Michael, just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to lead us through today's excellent webinar, and would also like to thank Athru for its continuing partnership in helping UNICON with our communications efforts and initiative. Dan Collins, thanks to you for organizing the technical aspects of today's webinar. As I mentioned, we'll be posting this to the UNICON website, and we'll look forward to future webinars through the remainder of the year. I'm not seeing any further questions, so with that, Michael, I think you're free. Would also like to thank the members of UNICON for joining us for today's webinar. And again, stay tuned for UNICON newsletters and updates that will inform you of webinars to come. Michael, any final thoughts or comments?
Just thanks again to you, Rob, and to Dan for pulling this together, and for everyone who attends today. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to folks. And again, I encourage you to pop on to UNICON's website and read through these two articles we referenced today and multiple other articles that we have out there that I think can really help you with your day-to-day work.
Excellent. And Dan's just reminding me that the way we'll post the recording of this will be through YouTube. So you should receive, if you've joined us today, you should receive a follow-up email with instructions on how to access the recording via YouTube. And with that, I will bring the webinar to a close. Thanks all, and have a great day.